"The only episode I'm having is realizing what you've done to me," Alice replied steadily. She looked at Jessica and Daniel, two people she'd known for less than 24 hours but who had shown her more respect than the Bradleys had in months. "I want both of you out of my house. Please tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love to know how far our stories reach." Now, let's start from the beginning. 4 days earlier, Alice had been arranging chrysanthemums in crystal vases throughout her home, humming the old hymn William used to sing while shaving. At 69, Alice Whitmore moved through her sprawling Victorian mansion with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent nearly 5 decades learning every creaky floorboard and temperamental light switch. Her silver hair caught the autumn sunlight streaming through tall windows, and her cardigan, hand-knitted in soft lavender, complemented the warm amber of her eyes. Alice was adjusting a particularly stubborn chrysanthemum when boots stamped on her back porch. Through the kitchen window, she watched Frank Bradley emerge from his pickup truck, tool belt slung over his shoulder like a gunslinger's holster. Behind him, his wife Karen balanced grocery bags against her hip, her practical ponytail already escaping its elastic band in the November wind. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," Frank called, letting himself into the mudroom with the familiarity of someone who'd been granted such privileges. At 45, Frank possessed the kind of steady competence that put people at ease, calloused hands that spoke of honest work, an easy smile that crinkled the corners of his green eyes, and a voice that carried just enough gravel to suggest reliability without roughness. "The weather service is calling for a real storm," Karen added, following her husband inside. She moved with efficient economy, every gesture purposeful, every word measured. At 42, Karen Bradley had perfected the art of helpful invisibility, the kind of woman who anticipated needs before they were voiced and solved problems before they became crises. Alice's face brightened at their arrival. In the 2 years since William's death, the Bradleys had become more than service providers. They were the closest thing to family she had left, besides her sister Beatrice up in Chicago. Frank handled the endless maintenance demands of the old house, while Karen had gradually assumed responsibility for the dozens of small tasks that had once fallen to William. Grocery shopping, appointment scheduling, even sorting through the daily deluge of mail that seemed to multiply in complexity each year. "Another storm," Alice mused, watching clouds gather on the horizon. For just a moment, something flickered in her mind. A memory of William saying something about storms and insurance, something important. But the thought slipped away like water through her fingers. "I used to love them when William was alive. We'd build a fire and play cards until the power came back on." "Well, you don't have to weather this one alone," Karen said, unpacking groceries with practiced efficiency. "Frank's got that list of repairs you wanted done, and I picked up enough supplies to last us through whatever Mother Nature throws our way." Alice felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied any mention of repairs. According to Frank's careful documentation, the old house seemed to be falling apart faster than she could afford to fix it. Just last month, he'd presented her with a $15,000 estimate for foundation work. She couldn't remember discussing it, but then again, there were many things she couldn't remember clearly these days. "I keep meaning to call Beatrice about visiting," Alice said, settling into her favorite kitchen chair. "It's been too long since we've seen each other." Karen's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "You know how stressful travel can be at our age," she said gently. "And with all the financial pressure you've been under lately, maybe it's better to wait until things settle down. Remember what happened last time you tried to call her? You got so confused on the phone." Alice frowned. She didn't remember getting confused, but then again, Karen was probably right. Karen was always right about these things. "I just don't understand how everything got so expensive." Frank's expression softened with understanding. "These old houses are like beautiful, demanding mistresses, Mrs. Whitmore. They'll charm you into bankruptcy if you're not careful. That's why Karen and I have been trying to help you see the bigger picture. Your late husband, God rest his soul, he was from a different generation. Today's maintenance costs would shock him." Outside, the first snowflakes began to fall. Not the gentle, lazy drift of a normal November snow, but the purposeful, driving precipitation that announced a storm's serious intentions. Alice watched them through the kitchen window and for a brief moment felt oddly clear-headed. She remembered standing in this same spot with William, his arm around her waist, as he'd explained his careful financial planning. "The house will always be our security, Alice," he'd said. "I've made sure of that." But why did that seem so different from what Frank was telling her? "I should probably head home before the roads get bad," Karen said, though she made no move toward her coat. "Oh, please don't," Alice said quickly, the moment of clarity fading. "The guest rooms are always ready, and I do worry about the furnace in weather like this. William always said 2 people could handle emergencies better than 1. Frank smiled. "If you're sure we won't be imposing, we'd be happy to stay. I can keep an eye on the generator, and Karen can help with dinner." "It's settled then," Alice said, clapping her hands together with genuine pleasure. "It'll be nice to have voices in the house again." As afternoon melted into evening, Alice found herself feeling more energetic than usual. Without her typical afternoon rest period, another routine Karen had established, her mind felt surprisingly sharp. When the phone rang briefly, Alice moved to answer it, but Karen intercepted smoothly. "I'll handle that," Karen said, her tone pleasant but firm. "You shouldn't have to deal with telemarketers during a storm." But as Alice watched Karen's face during the brief conversation, she noticed something odd. Karen's expression shifted from pleasant to concerned, to almost guilty. And she hung up much too quickly for a telemarketer. "Who was it?" Alice asked. "Nobody important. Just someone with the wrong number." The storm intensified beyond anyone's predictions. Snow accumulated in thick, wet layers that bent tree branches toward the ground and muffled all sound, except the wind's increasingly aggressive howl. By dinner time, the road past Alice's house had disappeared entirely under a white blanket that showed no signs of thinning. Alice was pulling a casserole from the oven when headlights swept across her kitchen window, followed by the sound of car doors slamming. Through the swirling snow, she could make out 2 figures struggling toward her front porch, their forms bent against the wind like question marks. "Someone's out there," she called to Frank, who was stoking the fireplace in the living room. The doorbell's chime seemed almost absurd against the storm's soundtrack. Alice hurried to the front hall, her slippers whispering against hardwood floors, and pulled open the heavy oak door to reveal a young woman and man, both snow-covered and shivering violently. The woman appeared to be in her early 30s, with intelligent dark eyes and the kind of competent bearing that suggested she was accustomed to handling crises. Despite being soaked to the skin, she managed a grateful smile. "I'm so sorry to bother you," she said, her voice chattering with cold. "Our car died about a mile down the road and we saw your lights. I'm Jessica Russo." The man beside her, tall, lean, with wire-rimmed glasses fogged by the temperature change, extended a gloved hand. "Daniel Russo. We were trying to reach Indianapolis before the storm hit, but..." He gestured helplessly at the weather. "Don't apologize," Alice said, ushering them inside immediately. "I'm Alice Whitmore, and you're absolutely welcome here. Frank, could you help them with their coats? Karen, we'll need extra places at dinner." The Bradleys appeared from different corners of the house, Frank carrying towels and Karen already mentally adjusting her meal preparations. Introductions were made amid the bustle of getting their unexpected guests warm and dry, and within an hour, all 5 were gathered around Alice's dining room table as candles flickered against the storm's growing fury. "This house is incredible," Jessica said, admiring the hand-carved crown molding. "The restoration work must have taken years." 47 years and counting, Alice replied, her eyes sparkling with pride. "William, my husband, and I bought it as newlyweds. Everyone thought we were crazy, taking on something this enormous, but we saw its potential." "The craftsmanship is remarkable," Daniel observed, running his fingers along the mahogany table's edge. "Houses like this are incredible investments when properly maintained." Frank nodded, but his expression grew somber. "That's exactly what makes them so expensive to maintain. Mrs. Whitmore's been dealing with one crisis after another." Foundation issues, electrical problems, plumbing disasters, the works. Alice's face clouded slightly. Sometimes I wonder if I'm being foolish, trying to hang on to something I can't really afford anymore. What kind of expenses are we talking about? Daniel asked, his professional instincts engaging. Just this year alone, we've had to address almost $60,000 in emergency repairs, Frank replied smoothly. When these old systems fail, they fail catastrophically. Jessica nearly choked on her wine. That figure seemed astronomical for a house this well maintained. That's quite a sum for 1 year. Overwhelming, Karen finished sympathetically. That's why we've been trying to help Alice think practically about her options. Alice excused herself to check on dessert, leaving the 4 others at the table. In the kitchen, she found herself staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Strange, she felt clearer tonight than she had in months. Usually by evening, she felt foggy and confused, but tonight her mind felt sharp. She paused, trying to remember why that might be different. Back in the dining room, Jessica was studying the elaborate chandelier overhead. Is that original Waterford crystal? Mrs. Whitmore has exquisite taste, Frank agreed, though beauty doesn't pay bills. True, Daniel said thoughtfully, but a property this size, in this condition, with this much land. He paused, thinking about his father's much smaller home and its valuation. The asset value alone should provide significant financial security. Frank's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Rural property markets aren't what they used to be. Plus, when you factor in all the hidden problems these old places harbor. What's your background, Mr. Russo? Karen asked, changing direction with practiced smoothness. I'm an attorney, Daniel replied. I recently had to help my elderly father with some property matters, so I've become familiar with how these situations can get complicated. Well, Frank said, his voice carrying a subtle edge, theory and practice don't always align. Alice needs practical solutions, not abstract valuations. The evening continued pleasantly, but Jessica found herself noticing small details that didn't quite fit. The way Karen intercepted Alice's attempt to answer the phone when it rang briefly. How Frank redirected conversation whenever Alice began discussing her late husband's financial planning. The subtle but persistent message that Alice was somehow incapable of managing her own affairs. Most troubling was Alice herself, bright and engaging one moment, then suddenly vague and uncertain when discussing anything involving money or decisions. Jessica had seen this pattern before, in her own family when her grandmother had lived with her uncle for those difficult months before they discovered what was really happening. When Alice insisted on giving Jessica and Daniel the master guest suite, they found themselves in a beautifully appointed room with a 4-poster bed and antique furniture that belonged in a museum. As they settled in for the night, neither could shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. Did you notice how they managed every conversation about Alice's finances? Jessica whispered. Daniel nodded grimly. Those repair costs seem unusually high. I helped my dad with extensive renovations on his 1920s house last year, and we didn't spend nearly that much. There's something else, Jessica said quietly. Alice's behavior, the way she seems sharp one moment and confused the next, I've seen that pattern before. What do you mean? My grandmother went through something similar when she was living with my uncle. He was giving her herbal supplements that were supposed to help with anxiety, but they actually made her confused and compliant. We didn't realize what was happening until it was almost too late. They lay awake listening to the storm, both thinking about the sweet, trusting woman downstairs and wondering what kind of situation she might really be in. The next morning dawned gray and cold, with snow still falling steadily. Alice woke feeling unusually clear-headed, a sensation she hadn't experienced in months. She lay in bed for a moment, trying to remember why she felt different. Then she realized she hadn't had her usual evening medications the night before. With guests in the house, Karen hadn't wanted to make a production of Alice's bedtime routine. And for the first time in she couldn't remember how long, her morning thoughts felt crisp and connected. In the kitchen, she found Karen already up, preparing her usual morning beverage, the special herbal tea blend that supposedly helped with energy and mental clarity. "You're awake early," Alice said warmly. Couldn't sleep with the storm, Karen replied, pressing the familiar cup into Alice's hands. This will help you feel more settled. Alice accepted the tea automatically, but something made her hesitate before drinking. Perhaps it was the unusual clarity of her thoughts, or maybe the way the tea had a slightly bitter undertone beneath the floral scents, something she'd never noticed before. You know, I think I'll wait until after breakfast, she said. I feel surprisingly alert this morning. Karen's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The tea really is better on an empty stomach. It helps with absorption. Absorption of what? Jessica asked, appearing in the doorway. Just herbs, Karen said quickly. Chamomile, lavender, things for relaxation and mental clarity. Jessica moved closer, casually examining the cup. The tea had that bitter undertone that shouldn't belong in a simple herbal blend. What specific herbs do you use? I'm always interested in natural remedies. Oh, just common ones, Karen replied vaguely. Nothing special. But Jessica was thinking about valerian root, passion flower, and other herbs that, in concentrated doses, could cause drowsiness, confusion, and memory problems. You know, she said carefully, I'm quite sensitive to herbal teas. They sometimes make me feel strange. Alice, how do you typically feel after drinking yours? Alice considered the question with surprising focus. This was the clearest she'd felt in months, and she was reluctant to drink anything that might change that. Well, I do feel calmer afterward. But often I get confused about things. I thought it was just... She paused, suddenly remembering something William used to say about trusting her own instincts. Just age. Frank finished, entering the kitchen with his usual confident bearing. Morning, everyone. How did you sleep through that wind? Alice was just telling us about her morning routine, Daniel said, joining the group. It sounds very comprehensive. Routine is important for elderly people, Frank said, his tone slightly patronizing. It helps with confusion and memory issues. Alice bristled slightly. I'm not confused this morning. In fact, I feel clearer than I have in months. She set the teacup down on the counter, decision made. The change in Alice was already noticeable to Jessica and Daniel. Her posture was straighter, her voice stronger, her eyes more focused. Without whatever was in that morning tea, Alice seemed to be emerging from a fog. Mrs. Whitmore, Daniel said gently, I'd like to ask you something if you don't mind. Do you remember what your financial situation was like when your husband first passed away? Alice's brow furrowed in concentration. I think it was quite good. William was very careful with money, very organized. He always said the house was our greatest asset, our insurance policy. She paused, looking confused. But Frank has shown me bills and statements that look so different from what I remember. When was the last time you spoke directly to your bank, your financial advisor? Alice struggled to remember. I don't think I have recently. Frank said it would be too stressful for me. He and Karen handle all the calls and meetings now. Jessica and Daniel exchanged alarmed glances. The pattern was becoming clear. Systematic isolation, controlled information, and chemical compliance through the morning tea routine. Alice, Jessica said carefully, I need to tell you something. What you're describing, the confusion, memory problems, feeling different after drinking tea, it reminds me of what happened to my grandmother. Your grandmother? My uncle was taking care of her, and he started giving her these herbal supplements that were supposed to help with stress, but they actually made her confused and forgetful. We didn't realize what was happening until we stopped the supplements and she became clear-headed again. Alice looked at the cup she'd set aside, then back at Jessica's concerned face. You think there might be something in my tea that's causing the confusion? I think it's possible, Jessica said gently, her voice tight with remembered anger about her own family's experience. And I'm concerned that Frank and Karen may have been taking advantage of that confusion to handle your affairs in ways you might not have chosen. The kitchen fell silent, except for the storm still raging outside. Alice looked from Jessica to Daniel to the Bradleys, her mind racing with a clarity she hadn't felt in years. They've been medicating me? She whispered. Frank stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from helpful to authoritative. Alice, don't listen to these people. They're strangers trying to turn you against the people who've been caring for you. Caring for me? Alice's voice grew stronger. By putting things in my tea? By keeping me away from my sister? She stopped, memories flooding back with startling clarity. By having me sign papers I don't remember agreeing to? Karen moved closer to Alice, her expression no longer entirely friendly. You're getting upset over nothing. You signed those papers willingly. You asked us to help you because you were feeling overwhelmed. What papers? Daniel asked quietly. Frank hesitated, then pulled a manila folder from his jacket pocket. Property management documents, power of attorney arrangements, all perfectly legal, all signed with proper witnesses. Alice reached for the folder, but Frank pulled it back. Alice, you don't need to worry about these complicated legal matters. That's exactly why you asked us to handle them. I want to see them, Alice said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone. Those are my papers, about my property. I have a right to see them. Reluctantly, Frank handed over the folder. As Alice read, her face went white, then flushed with anger. These documents, they give you complete control over my house, my money, my medical decisions. You signed them, Karen insisted. You said you trusted us to take care of you. I signed them because you were drugging me, Alice said, her voice rising. You made me confused and dependent so you could control everything. Frank reached for the papers, but Daniel stepped between them. Mrs. Whitmore has every right to review her own legal documents. This is ridiculous, Frank said, his patience clearly wearing thin. Alice is obviously having some kind of mental health episode, probably brought on by the stress of the storm and too much stimulation from strangers. The only episode I'm having is realizing what you've done to me, Alice replied steadily. She looked at Jessica and Daniel, two people she'd known for less than 24 hours, but who had shown her more respect than the Bradleys had in months. I want both of you out of my house. We're not going anywhere in this storm, Frank said, dropping his helpful facade entirely. The roads are impassable, and frankly, Alice, you're in no condition to make rational decisions right now. Are you refusing to leave when she's asked you to? Daniel asked. Karen's expression had turned cold. We're not abandoning a confused elderly woman during a crisis. That would be irresponsible. Alice stood slowly, drawing herself up to her full height. For the first time in 2 years, she felt completely, utterly clear about what was happening. I'm not confused. You've been making me confused, and I want you out of my house. That's not going to happen, Frank said flatly. At least not until we've resolved this situation properly. The morning stretched into afternoon with all 5 people trapped together by the storm and circumstance. The Bradleys retreated to their room, presumably planning their next move, while Alice, Jessica, and Daniel remained in the main areas of the house. For Alice, it was like awakening from a 2-year nightmare. Without the daily fog of whatever had been in her tea, she could think clearly, remember details, and make connections that had been impossible before. She found William's old filing cabinet in his den, a room the Bradleys had always discouraged her from entering, and discovered his carefully organized financial records. Look at this, she said, showing Jessica and Daniel bank statements from 2 years ago. According to William's records, our investments were generating enough income to cover all household expenses, plus maintenance reserves. Daniel studied the documents with growing anger. These show a very healthy financial situation. What did the Bradleys tell you your current balance was? They said I was nearly broke, that I'd been spending irresponsibly and the house repairs had depleted everything. This is systematic financial abuse. They isolated you, medicated you, and then manipulated your understanding of your own resources. Jessica's voice carried personal pain. It's exactly what my uncle tried to do to my grandmother. 2 years of my life, Alice said quietly, stolen day by day. But not today, Daniel pointed out. Today you fought back. As evening approached, the storm finally began to weaken. The wind's howl diminished to a whisper, and the snow changed from driving sheets to gentle flakes. Alice felt a mixture of relief and apprehension, relief that help would soon be available, but apprehension about what the Bradleys might try before then. Her concerns proved justified when Frank appeared in the living room doorway, his expression grim and determined. "Alice, we need to resolve this situation," he said. "You're clearly having some kind of breakdown, probably brought on by the stress and stopping your medications abruptly." "The only breakdown I'm having is realizing what you've done to me," Alice replied steadily. "What we've done is try to help a confused, lonely widow who couldn't handle her own affairs," Karen said, joining her husband. "Everything we did was with your consent and approval." "Consent obtained through drugging and manipulation," Daniel said quietly. Frank ignored him, focusing entirely on Alice. "You trusted us for 2 years. We've been like family to you. Don't let these strangers destroy that relationship." "Family doesn't drug family," Alice said quietly. "Family doesn't steal from family." "We were trying to protect you." Karen's composure finally cracked. "Do you have any idea how vulnerable you are? How easily someone could take advantage of you?" "Someone did take advantage of me," Alice said with devastating calm. "You did." Frank's mask slipped entirely. "Fine. You want to know the truth? You're a foolish old woman sitting on a fortune while the world passes you by. We did what needed to be done." "My future or yours?" "Our future," Frank replied coldly. "We've invested 2 years of our lives in this arrangement. We're not walking away empty-handed." "And if I refuse to cooperate?" Frank's smile was calculating, but his voice remained almost conversational. "These old houses can be treacherous, Alice, especially during storms like this. People get disoriented, take a wrong step on icy floors, slip down those beautiful hardwood stairs of yours." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Accidents happen all the time in weather like this." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Jessica and Daniel moved closer to Alice, forming an unconscious barrier between her and the Bradleys. "You're threatening to hurt her," Daniel said quietly. "I'm discussing the unfortunate realities of elderly people living alone during severe weather," Frank replied smoothly. "Especially those who make impulsive decisions about stopping important medications." "What about us?" Jessica asked. Karen's expression had turned cold. "Storms are unpredictable. Sometimes good Samaritans who stop to help, well, sometimes they become victims too." Alice felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. All her life, she'd been kind, trusting, accommodating. She'd deferred to William's judgment, then fallen into the trap of deferring to the Bradleys' manipulation. But sitting in her beloved home, surrounded by the memories and possessions that represented her life's work, Alice Whitmore discovered reserves of strength she'd forgotten she possessed. "No," she said simply. "No?" Frank laughed harshly. "You don't have a choice, Alice." "I have the same choice I've always had," Alice said, rising to her feet with newfound dignity. "The choice to fight for what's mine." That night, Alice, Jessica, and Daniel barricaded themselves in the library, taking turns keeping watch while the others rested. Alice spent the dark hours thinking about William, about the life they'd built together, about the legacy she refused to let these criminals steal. She also thought about the metal lockbox William had hidden behind the false back of his desk drawer, the one containing cash, important documents, and the loaded pistol he'd insisted they keep for emergencies. "I never thought I'd need to defend my own home," she whispered to Jessica during one of their watch shifts. "You're not just defending your home," Jessica replied. "You're defending your right to live freely in it." When dawn broke clear and bright, the storm had finally passed. The roads were still difficult, but Alice could see sunlight sparkling off fresh snow, and the silence felt different, expectant rather than threatening. Alice had used Daniel's phone during the night, when she finally got a signal, to call her sister Beatrice. The conversation had been brief but revealing. "Alice, oh my God, I've been trying to reach you for months," Beatrice had cried. "Every time I called, that woman said you were too sick to talk to anyone. I was about to drive down there myself." "They told me you didn't want to be bothered with my problems," Alice had replied, understanding the full scope of her isolation for the first time. "That's insane. I've been worried sick about you." Now, as morning light filled the library, Alice felt a profound sense of clarity about what needed to happen. The sound of heavy engines broke the morning quiet. Through the library windows, Alice watched a convoy of vehicles working their way up her long driveway: snowplows, police cars, and an ambulance. "Did you call them?" Alice asked Daniel. "Last night, when I finally got a signal," he admitted, "I contacted the county sheriff and explained the situation. They've been waiting for the roads to clear." Frank and Karen appeared in the library doorway, their faces gray with defeat and desperation. "This isn't over," Frank said desperately. "You can't prove anything. It's your word against ours." "Actually," Jessica said, holding up her phone with satisfaction, "I've been recording everything since yesterday morning, including your threats to hurt us." "You had no right," Karen said desperately. "I had every right to document crimes being committed against an elderly person," Jessica replied firmly. The front doorbell rang. Alice walked toward it with more confidence than she'd felt in years, ready to open the door to her new life, a life free from manipulation, fear, and chemical fog. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The police officer was professional and kind. "I'm Officer Thompson with the County Sheriff's Department. We received reports of elder abuse and fraud at this address." "Yes," Alice said clearly, her voice strong and certain. "I'd like to file charges against Frank and Karen Bradley for fraud, theft, abuse, and threatening to harm me and my guests." As the investigation unfolded over the following hours, the full scope of the Bradleys' operation became clear. They had been targeting isolated elderly homeowners throughout the region, using variations of the same systematic approach: gain trust, establish dependence, manipulate decision-making, and ultimately steal assets. Alice's case would become crucial evidence in prosecuting a conspiracy that had victimized at least 6 other elderly residents, some of whom had lost their homes entirely before the scheme was discovered. But the most important moment came that afternoon, when Alice finally made the phone call she'd been prevented from making for months. "Beatrice, it's Alice. I know it's been too long, but I need you to know I'm free now. I'm finally free." Her sister's voice, warm and familiar and infinitely precious, brought tears to Alice's eyes. "Alice, honey, I've been so worried. Every time I tried to call, that woman said you were too sick to talk." "I was sick," Alice said, "but I'm better now, much better, and I have so much to tell you." Jessica and Daniel stayed an extra day to help Alice contact her real financial advisors and begin the process of undoing the damage. It turned out that her financial situation was exactly what she'd remembered: comfortable, secure, with enough resources to maintain her beloved house for decades to come. "The good news is that financial crimes leave clear trails," Daniel explained as they reviewed genuine bank statements. "Everything they stole can be traced and recovered." "What about the house repairs?" Alice asked. "Were any of them real?" "Some," Daniel admitted after reviewing Frank's invoices, "but probably less than 30% of what you were charged for. They created emergencies that didn't exist and inflated costs for legitimate work." As Jessica and Daniel prepared to continue their journey to Indianapolis, Alice felt the profound sadness of saying goodbye to people who had saved not just her money, but her life itself. "How can I ever thank you?" she asked. "By living well," Jessica said warmly. "By enjoying your beautiful home and reconnecting with people who love you. And by trusting your instincts," Daniel added. "You're stronger and smarter than anyone ever gave you credit for, including yourself." 6 months later, Alice stood in her living room, arranging chairs in a circle while spring sunlight streamed through the tall windows she'd once thought she might lose forever. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 4 o'clock, and she could hear cars pulling into her driveway. "Alice, should I put the tea service in the kitchen or bring it in here?" Beatrice called from the other room. Her sister had driven down from Chicago the week before, ostensibly to help Alice host her first book club meeting, but really because she still worried and wanted to see Alice's new life with her own eyes. "In here, please," Alice replied, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle from her favorite blue dress. "I want everything to feel welcoming." The doorbell chimed, and Alice opened it to find Margaret Williams, the librarian who'd suggested Alice join the book club, along with 2 other women Alice had met at the Advocacy Center. "Alice, how wonderful to see you again," Margaret said warmly, handing over a covered dish. I brought those lemon bars you mentioned loving. As the group settled into the circle of chairs, Alice marveled at the sound of conversation filling her home again. These women, ranging in age from 45 to 78, represented something Alice had never thought she'd have again: genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation. Before we discuss the book, said Helen, a retired teacher whose own experience with financial elder abuse had led her to the advocacy center, I wanted to thank Alice again for testifying at the Bradleys' sentencing. Your courage helped get justice not just for yourself, but for all of us. Alice felt a familiar tightness in her throat. The trial had been difficult, but seeing Frank and Karen Bradley led away in handcuffs had been profoundly healing. We all helped each other, she said simply. That's what community does. Speaking of community, Margaret said with a mischievous smile, I have news. The state legislature passed the Elder Protection Act last week. Better oversight for power of attorney arrangements, mandatory reporting for suspicious financial activity, the works. They're calling it the Whitmore Act. Alice's eyes filled with tears. William would be so proud, she whispered. As the afternoon progressed, the discussion of their chosen novel, a mystery about a woman who discovers her own strength, gave way to laughter, shared stories, and the kind of easy companionship Alice had thought was lost to her forever. When the last guest departed near sunset, Alice and Beatrice sat together in the sunroom, watching the last light play across the gardens. Alice was finally able to tend again. You know, Beatrice said, squeezing her sister's hand, when I think about what could have happened if those young people hadn't been stranded here that night. But they were, Alice replied firmly. Sometimes I think William sent them to me. A gift wrapped in a blizzard. The two sisters sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell, the house around them filled with the warmth of genuine friendship and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. Outside, the same wind that had once brought danger now carried only the promise of spring, and Alice Whitmore faced tomorrow with the unshakable knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, free, surrounded by love, and strong enough to help others find their way to the same bright clearing. As she often told the support groups she now facilitated, remember, you're stronger than you think, help can come from unexpected places, and it's never too late to fight for what's rightfully yours. The storm before the calm had taught her that even the darkest weather eventually breaks, revealing the clear sky that was always waiting underneath. Thank you for listening until the end. If you enjoyed the story, please consider leaving us a like. This helps us reach more people.